It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, you know, every now and then on the podcast, I do a rant. The subtitle of the show is Blues, News, and Interviews. A lot of the news falls into the domain of politics, but some of it is just plain news. And I try to make it, of interest to people around the world, hopefully, but certainly the United States. We try to keep from being parochial. I mean, it's about the heartland, obviously. A lot of the news is generated here within the state of Iowa, but I really like it when it applies elsewhere. And one of the news stories that certainly fits into that category is wind energy. Iowa is a leader in that, a national leader, and probably ranks right up there around the world as far as that's concerned. And it's, one of those feel-good stories. I've been feeling good about it for a long time. A third of Iowa's electricity comes from wind energy. What's not to like that? I mean, I'm all about green energy. And I got to preface the podcast a little bit. People that watch and listen know that, I'm a greenie, if you want to call it that. I'm a lefty. I mean, I like this. And here's my basic fundamental premise when it comes to green energy and wind energy and all of those sources. I'm a big supporter of it because unlike other forms of energy, nobody has to send a son or daughter off to a foreign land to implement regime change wars, go out there and bomb somebody, and have their sons and daughters come home in a box over it. We don't have to die over this to suck oil out of the ground somewhere else. So I'm all about wind energy. I'm all about solar energy. Even ethanol fits into that a little bit. A lot of people criticize ethanol because it's not that efficient. It's got some downsides, but as long as nobody's dying over it, as long as they're just picking a cornfield for it, I'm all up with that. So who doesn't like wind energy? Well, who doesn't like wind turbines? I grew up around them. Windmills were a part of my childhood growing up out on the farm. I see them out there. They're big. It's hard to miss them. But I didn't really realize that there's such a resistance to them. I heard Trump talk about them a little bit in the news, and of course, anything that he's opposed to, if he's opposed to wind energy and wind turbines, he talked about that. Okay, then I'm pretty much for it. I mean, that's kind of the way that I look at it. But here comes this story just in the past week or so. Front page story in the Des Moines Register. And I'm going to read this, and you have to bear with me a little bit because it's the only way I know to get to it. But the headline was, Wind Proposal Stokes Concerns of Wipeout. Now, this is by Donnell Eller in the Des Moines Register, part of the USA Today network, and I'm just going to read parts of it. But it says, Mid-American Energy says a Madison County proposal that would require turbines be built 1.5 miles away from the nearest home, 1.5 miles, would wipe out wind development in the state of Iowa if other counties were to follow suit. Iowa's largest investor-owned utility is fighting a Madison County Board of Health recommendation that those turbines or turbines, whatever you want to say, be built farther from their homes. Now, you can almost see Madison County from my home. So this is where we get into that local news that has statewide impact, that has national impact, maybe worldwide. The board down there says current commercial wind turbine distances are inadequate to protect public health. However, the proposed setback would completely wipe out any future wind development in Iowa if other Iowa counties were to adopt the greater distance requirements, said Adam Jablonski, director of Mid-American's Renewable Energy Program. Now, that proposed setback is 5 times larger than Mid-America has proposed for its 52-turbine wind farm in northwest Iowa. Jablonski spoke at the Madison County Board of Supervisors this past Tuesday, along with about a dozen residents who both support and oppose wind development. Supervisors haven't taken action on the health board's recommendation, but they did agree to hold a public hearing to consider a moratorium on wind and solar development through January 2022. That's down there in Madison County while the board considers new rules. The moratorium wouldn't affect Mid-America's proposed wind farm, which already had county approval, but the project is tied up in a citizen's lawsuit that is currently under appeal. Now, the Register says the fight in Madison County has emerged as controversy around the turbines has grown. Iowa utilities are rapidly adopting wind energy, taking effective advantage of federal tax credits and promoting the environmental benefits that Apple, Google, and other tech companies in Iowa welcome that have all landed here. And here's that stat again. 37% of the state's electricity comes from wind, the largest share in the nation. Mid-American alone has more than 2,600 operating wind turbines across Iowa, with thousands of people living within close proximity of them. This Jablonski fellow said. Complaints are few and far between. He pointed to a review by 3 Iowa groups of health studies around wind energy that was released in January. Those researchers said there is little scientific evidence to support residents' concerns that turbines the sound and flickers from those things are hurting health. Neighbors complain that the turbine sounds and spinning blades cause headaches, nausea, sleep disturbance, and other programs. The group's paper said research studies found that sound from the turbines may be annoying, but no adverse health effects have been established. A Madison County resident that appeared at this meeting this week opposes the turbine. She said she'd gotten sick near her home. She says, if I'm out in my yard, I can get dizzy. It's almost like car sickness. I've had to quit what I'm doing and go vomit, she says. Now, she says she's got about a dozen or so of those turbines. They're within 2 miles of her family's home. And at a press conference Tuesday, Governor Kim Reynolds said farmers and local governments welcomed the added income from the wind turbines. Yeah, I know a lot of people that like that. For example, Mid-American has an existing wind farm down there in Madison County expected to generate $38 million over 3 decades. But she said it's up to local governments to determine how they operate. They're the ones that grant them and can make the decision not to, Reynolds said. Well, we've talked about that kind of thing on Podcast by George before. It's kind of this federalism versus local government thing. And sometimes be careful what you wish for. Returning things to local government, depending on who and what your local government is, may not be what you wish for. Okay, so now here's another quote. And this is not from the Register article. Most will agree that economic or technological progress should not introduce health problems. That's from Carrie Johansson, Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council. To find if problems exist with wind electricity production, well-constructed scientific studies, rather than the anecdotes or unsubstantiated sources, should be our guide. Now, the Iowa Environmental Council is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that educates, advocates, and builds coalitions to raise awareness, generate action, and impact policy. Well, that sounds good to me, and I thought I got to get those folks on the line. And with us on the Podcast by George live line is Carrie Johansson. And I want to thank her off the top, not only for coming on the podcast, but listening through that article that I just read, which she's well aware of because they're all of this. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
One of the reasons I wanted to get with you right away is I know that you folks published a paper. There was research done on this, as much scientific analysis as possible just this past winter. It's still relatively new. And I was wondering if you might start off talking about that effort and the findings that were in that paper.
Certainly. So, I started my position as Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council in June of 2018 after a long history working in energy policy, clean energy policy. We were starting to see at that time that there was more questions were being raised about wind energy in different parts of the state. And one of the questions we heard frequently raised was related to health concerns. Now, I am not a doctor and I am not a PhD toxicologist. And so when I'm reading research, I look for good sources, but it was really important to me to know that what we were basing our advocacy and our education on was really good, solid science. There is a lot of junk science out there around wind turbines and health, and so what I did was go right to the source. I went to someone we work with frequently at the University of Iowa College of Public Health, David Osterberg, who had looked into this issue, and he reached out to Dr. Peter Thorne at the University of Iowa as well. And the three of us put our heads together. Dr. Thorne and David Osterberg took a look at, what is the best peer-reviewed scientific literature around wind turbines and health effects. And they went to two peer-reviewed analyses of all of the literature out there. One of these reviews was done at MIT. The other was done by the Canadian Academy of Sciences, which is similar to the American Academy of the same name. And both of these found that there is an association between the presence of wind turbines and annoyance, but they did not determine that there are any negative health consequences related to wind turbines and people's health.
Oh, so annoyance, but not health concerns. Okay, so let's make a little distinction here and kind of remember what I said to begin with. One of the reasons I'm a big supporter of these turbines is it keeps sons and daughters of America from being killed getting oil from other lands, although, the government might tell you there's other reasons to be over there and all that, but that's got a lot to do with the Middle East and that crisis over there. Being killed as opposed to a few, it sounds like to me, having annoyance. That's what you found, annoyance, right?
Yes, and the other thing to note about the finding of annoyance is that the studies have not parsed out whether the annoyance is due to having a change of view of what folks are seeing out their window, or whether there's any kind of physical reason related to the annoyance. It's not been parsed out what the annoyance is related to. And some other research that's been done has identified what could be considered confounding factors that are pretty interesting. One of the effects is called the nocebo effect, and what that means is that people who are given information that they're going to experience some kind of negative health impact will tend to have that experience whether they have that effect or not, whether they've been exposed or not.
And that's not a theory. That's a fact. I mean, that's a big deal in the medical profession. You hear about it all the time, positive and negative. If people believe that something is going to happen, oftentimes it does. The nocebo effect.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And these experiments were done, duplicated experiments, where folks were either exposed or not exposed to infrasound in a closed booth, which infrasound is the type of sound that people who are spreading misinformation about wind turbines, they point to infrasound as the health threat. And that sound that's below the level of human hearing, it's at a frequency that's lower than human hearing. People were shown videos that were either positive videos about wind energy or negative videos and videos about the potential health impacts from wind energy. They went into a booth and were either exposed or not exposed to infrasound on a randomized basis, and then afterwards were asked about how they were physically feeling. They found a relationship between the information they were given before the experiment, but no relationship with whether or not they were actually exposed to infrasound. And so there's just a lot of data out there that actually it's the exposure to this misinformation versus any actual physical effect that is causing folks to have physical symptoms and distress.
And not to say that they don't have the symptoms, that they're not real. I mean, these folks aren't, you don't want to, I wouldn't want to anyway, accuse these people of not telling the truth, or, I mean, they may genuinely be ill as to what the cause is, though. I mean, that's very difficult to determine. I kind of use this joke a lot of times when I'm talking with people. They say, well, I got dizzy, I had vertigo. I mean, I don't know if it's my inner ear or whatever. And I said, well, I'll tell him, don't worry about it. I used to get dizzy every Saturday night. Well, I'd been up to the bar for 2 hours. This was back in the day. I mean, there's a cause and effect thing. I mean, to extend the argument, they pick up the garbage out in front of my house every week, and I don't feel as good as I used to. Well, I'm getting old. I mean, I there's a reason for me not to feel as good as I used to. I don't have as much energy. I'm lethargic. Does it have anything to do with them picking the garbage out up in front of my house every week? Probably not. But they do coincide. They are coincidental. You can draw a line there if you want to, but, that's not what research and scientific study is all about. Before I forget, I want to ask you, where does the council come down on wind energy? Here's kind of the way that I look at it. Solar energy, I mean, who doesn't like that? I can't think of any downside to that. Maybe it's not the most efficient in the world. Wind energy, well, we're talking about that, so we understand that. I mentioned ethanol, not real efficient. It takes a lot of energy to produce the energy. Nuclear energy, which I am adamantly opposed to, because of the waste. They go store that away. They put it away. It's going to be there forever. They don't know what's going to happen to it or what to do with it. So I'm opposed to nuclear energy on that basis. Does the council come down, have an opinion on wind energy? Where does it rank or rate, or how should we look at that as far as an energy source is concerned?
Overall, the council has a goal of seeing Iowa reach 100% clean energy. Climate change is the absolute number one crisis to our planet and our health in the future right now. And so we think a combination of resources that includes wind, solar, energy storage, and then just really efficient use of the energy that we do have is the recipe for getting to a 100% renewable energy system that gets us away from fossil fuels. And so in Iowa, wind, we have some of the best wind resources anywhere in the country. We actually need to be an exporter of wind in Iowa if we're going to do our part to help decarbonize the whole grid in the United States. And so the council, we're supportive of these other technologies as well, but we do think that Iowa needs to continue to be a place where wind energy grows.
And can it grow here, and can the same growth be experienced around the country, maybe even around the world? Is there room for this to grow?
Oh, absolutely. And it depends upon what the wind resource is. And the central United States is really the center of wind. And you're seeing that if you look at a map of where the wind resources are. Oklahoma has exploded in terms of wind siting. North and South Dakota are really starting to ramp up. One of the issues we've had is that there hasn't been enough transmission to take the wind from being where it's being produced to where it's being used. And transmission lines are actually a really important piece of being able to have a 100% renewable grid, because you're going to have, the sun's going to be shining brightly someplace where maybe there's wind not available at that time. Well, then the wind's going to pick up. You can ship that where it's needed, even if, you have a cloud go over the sun or it's nighttime or something like that. So having a grid with all of these different resources that are really flexible and can be easily transmitted is kind of the key to reaching that mix of 100%.
We're talking to Carrie Johansson with the Iowa Environmental Council regarding wind as a wind energy source. I was just at a campaign event. That's what I do with the podcast. I go out and check out the candidates as they're appearing around Iowa, and Tulsi Gabbard was at the wind generation turbine plant where they make the windmills out there in Newton, Iowa, and she was really impressed by it. She's a big supporter of it. She would like to see it again spread across the land and in Hawaii and where she's from and everywhere. And I also had a conversation with a guy here recently. He's I guess you could call him a turbine tech for Mid-American Energy, actually. And the way I put it to him was, I said, these wind turbines, I mean, they're massive, they're ugly, people don't like the wind that they create and the birds that they kill and the fact that they're so unsightly and large, and some of the homes that are near them are affected by them more directly than others. But to me, it looks like it reminds me of the big iron, they used to call it, the steam-powered and the big tractors that were on farmland in Iowa originally. And they weren't very efficient. They didn't work very well. They were sure better than horses. There were a lot of upside to it. And eventually the tractors became more efficient, more powerful. They also became smaller. So I look at these turbines and I think, is that in their future? Can they be that way? Now, I was talking to this tech, Carrie, and he told me I didn't know about that. The reason being, the efficiency of the turbines is due to their size, and because of their size, you can have fewer of them in an area and generate the same amount of energy or more energy than smaller turbines. So he wasn't so sure of that. Has the council ever looked into that? Do you have any perspective on that?
I don't have a lot of perspective on that. I know that there are, kind of annually discussions about different turbine designs. Folks talk about vertical axis wind turbines that would maybe have, a lower impact visually. But the fact is that the turbines, as they're designed right now, are designed to eke out as much efficiency as possible. And the other designs that have been pitched out there, they've just not reached that level of efficiency. Certainly, I would not put my money on the development of technology stopping here. I think we're in a really exciting time for advances in clean energy technology, and so I wouldn't say that I know the answer to that question right now. I think we're going to see all kinds of amazing innovations over the next 20 years.
And I'm kind of putting you on the spot a little bit. Here's another question that may not be in your wheelhouse, but for these people that are directly affected, let's say you believe in effect you're getting sick from having one located near your home. Well, because these things are so profitable, and because there's so much, particularly long-term revenue associated with them, why can't Mid-American Energy or the state or somebody provide these people with a stipend to buy them out, so to speak, so that they can move? I know a lot of folks, maybe it's their childhood home or whatever, and they don't want to move away from it. But if you're really being sickened by it, why not make it possible so that they can move away from it? Because the fact of the matter is there are people that want them. I mean, they'd like to be there for the revenue stream and the energy that they provided. Has there ever been a discussion to that you know of?
So no, but there's a really interesting angle on that. I think that question brings up another interesting piece of science that was done, and that was judging people's feelings, people's report of health impacts related to whether or not they were being compensated for the change in their view shed from the turbine. So this is, in a lot of cases, the landowner gets a lease payment for the turbine, but the neighbors are not compensated. Some developers and utilities have gone to the model of offering some level of compensation to everybody who is in the general vicinity of the turbines or the turbine farm. So some level of compensation. They've found that to be actually a very effective way of making neighbors feel better about the project. So
literally,
that is something. Yeah,
that can make them feel better physically. I mean, because it has that effect. You placebo, nocebo, or whatever. But if you can reconcile the fact that maybe you weren't feeling too good, but you're being compensated, and there's a good feeling associated with that, it literally might make you feel better overall.
Yeah, and I'm very sensitive to the idea that somehow this is in people's heads. That is not what I'm saying, and that is not what we said in our paper. We see these nocebo effects. We see the effects of compensation. We know that people are feeling distress based on, some aspect of these turbines being their new neighbors, and that, that annoyance or distress, or the understanding of the technology is causing physical symptoms for these folks. I don't I don't like to see that. I mean, I think we want everybody to be happy and healthy and living, the best possible life from an environmental perspective and with their families. And so, my concern and my goal is not to say, that these folks are, imagining it and that the answer is to just say, never mind. It's that there needs to be good information available so that people have reliable sources and that they don't have to suffer from this kind of distress.
And one other thing here, and we're getting close to our end time, so I've got to wrap it up. Can you tell us, based on what's on the boards right now, we mentioned this, about a third of the state's electricity needs are provided by wind. Where's that number going to go, say, in the next 5-10 years, something like that, the short term? And how is the number of these turbines going to grow in the state of Iowa from what we have today to what we know is going to happen here, well, pending, blockades by these local governments or whatever, in the short term?
Sure. So we're at about a little over 8,000 megawatts of wind in Iowa right now. Based on what's been approved by the Iowa Utilities Board, we're going to hit the mile marker, a pretty significant mile marker of 10,000 megawatts of wind by 2020. That's something that, 10 years ago when NREL was putting out projections and they said, well, Iowa needs to reach 10,000 megawatts by 2020, everyone said, well, yeah, right. Well, that's where we are. Now, if we're going to make a significant dent in our policy goals in terms of climate change and freedom from fossil fuels, we're going to need to install another 10,000 megawatts of wind in Iowa by 2030. And so we are looking at, roughly doubling the current amount of wind in Iowa.
Doubling the amount of wind energy. Does that mean double the number of turbines? I mean, is it that simple, the math?
Well, not exactly, because like you mentioned earlier, the change in technology and the fact that turbines are getting more efficient because of the nacelles and the conversion. They're also bigger turbines can be appropriate in some locations, and so they might have a larger capacity. So it doesn't necessarily mean more turbines. It can be a change in technology. It can be repowering older turbines with new, more efficient technology as well. That can add capacity too. So there are a variety of different ways to add that capacity.
Well, that's great. I mean, this has been very informative. We've had a very nice conversation here. I've asked most of the questions that I had. Anything that you would like to add that I didn't get to that you feel you should close with here before we wrap up?
I guess I would like to point to, I always tell people I'm not a wind advocate because I love the way a wind turbine looks, with the setting sun behind it. I am an advocate for wind because I have an 8-year-old son, and I am concerned with his future, and the future of his generation and the future of our planet. When I look at wind energy, it is a clean solution. We are taking coal plants offline, reducing emissions of mercury and other pollutants into the air that are making people sick, causing heart disease, asthma, really having a terrible toxic impact on the communities where they are located. And so I'm very passionate about this topic because I care about my son and I care about the future of all of our kids in Iowa.
Well said, and it fits perfectly into a podcast by George because, like I tell folks over and over, the short-term threat that'll get us killed tomorrow maybe are the regime change wars, the nuclear threat that's out there, maybe the guns that are on our streets. That's short-term. I mean, that could end it all for you, me, and a lot of folks here immediately. Longer-term, and maybe not that long, climate change, and wind turbines fit into that big time. Well, that's great. I want to thank her again. That's Carrie Johansson, Energy Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council, shedding light, maybe a little bit of good wind, on the topic of wind energy in the state of Iowa and this news story about what's happening over there in Madison County. And if that updates, we'll update it on another podcast by George.